try to connect to someone new. We really are trying to be in community with one another, and we need you to reach out to folks here on this platform. So I'm excited for our next panel. Over the last several days leading up to this convening, I've been thinking a lot about a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates in his 2015 book, Between the World and Me, where he says, Black people love their children with a kind of obsession. You are all we have, and you come to us endangered. We love our children, yet our society has created conditions where we must fight to keep our children safe, and where ultimately policies and practices undermine kids being with family. There's such an urgency to stopping this active harm of family separation, the harm to children, the harm to parents, the harm to families, the harm to communities. The Adoptions and Safe Families Act is a law that has contributed immensely to the separation of families, particularly Black families. Our next panel, How We End Up Repealing the Adoptions and Safe Families Act, explores this problematic law. The panel begins with a conversation between Kathleen Creamer and April Lee, both advocates who work at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, and together have an upcoming paper about the racism and harm of ASFA. After they talk together, they will leave the stage and we will hear from organizers and activists from the Repeal ASFA campaign about how they came together and what we all must consider as we engage in this work to end the forcible separation of families. The second half of our conversation will be moderated by Bishop Marcia Dinkins. Bishop Dinkins is the founder and executive director of Black Women Rising, a grassroots organization that centers the voices and stories of Black women using a trauma-informed organizing approach for collective healing, power, and transformation. Bishop Dinkins will introduce the rest of the panelists during that part of this panel. So similar to earlier events, we will reserve time for questions from the audience, so please keep using the chat to send along your reflections or questions. So with that, I'm turning the floor over to Kathleen and April. Thank you so much for being here. We're so excited that you're here with us today.
Thank you so much for having us. I feel so lucky to be in this community. My name is Kathleen Kramer. I manage the Family Advocacy Unit where we represent parents in child welfare cases in Philadelphia, and I've been doing that for about 15 years. And I'm going to turn it over to April.
I'm April Lee. I'm a peer parent advocate, and what that means is I'm a person with lived experience, so I help birth parents navigate the complexities of the child welfare system.
And April, I'll let you start this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. We're just going to jump right in there because we don't have a whole lot of time, and there's so much that we can say to the harms of ASFA that would take way more than time given. So we're just going to jump in there. So I'm going to start with a question to you, Kathleen. Dorothy Roberts wrote in Shattered Bonds that the color of child welfare, the color of America's child welfare system is the reason why Americans tolerate its destructiveness. What does that mean to you?
So I think that most of us on this in this room are familiar with the disproportionality stats, or what we call disproportionality. But what I think sometimes gets missed from broader policy conversations about ASFA outside of rooms like this is the way that anti-Black rhetoric led to the development of the Adoption and Safe Families Act. So we had kind of what Dorothy Roberts calls the carceral logic behind ASFA really being driven and created by anti-Black rhetoric and logic. And we see that both in the design of ASFA and also in the impact of ASFA.
So I know a lot of times they say that ASFA isn't racist because we bring a lot of white people, children as well, into the system. So why is ASFA racist?
So let's dig into, I think part of understanding that is looking at the history of how the Adoption and Safe Families Act got passed. In the 1990s and into present day, was a time when anti-Black rhetoric really fueled our policy making. And we created kind of myth making about Black danger that allowed us to do all sorts of things in federal policy. So I want to tell you about some of the kind of Black caricatures that we created that really drove us to the kind of carceral policymaking that you see in the Adoption and Safe Families Act. So, of course, everyone is familiar with the welfare queen, right? That is an anti-Black caricature that led to welfare reform in the United States in the 1990s. And then also we're familiar with the super predator mythology, right? This idea that there are dangerous Black youth who are coming for us, right? Who are a unique danger to us and must be, as Hillary Clinton said, brought to heel through federal policy. And then we also saw, as the Adoption and Safe Families Act was being debated and pursued, a lot of myth making about dangerous parents, dangerous Black moms, crack moms, right? So there's a lot of interesting stuff out there. If you Google crack moms, you can see the way that we talked about mothers who were using substances was really anti-Black and really targeted at Black families. And then, you know, that kind of crack mom mythology and the idea of Black danger played out in how we thought about what we should do to support a piece of rhetoric that was flying around at the time that the Adoption and Safe Families Act was being debated is the idea that reasonable efforts kills. So one of the primary architects of ASFA said reasonable effort kills. And what he meant by that is it is dangerous to provide support to keep families together. So I could take a moment and just go through how that actually made its way into policy and the policy decisions that we made when we decided to pass the Adoption and Safe Families Act. I want to say very explicitly here, ASFA was designed with the goal of dismembering families. I'm going to say that again. ASFA was designed with the policy goal of dismembering families. So we had a lot of folks at the time that ASFA was being passed. In addition to all the anti-Black rhetoric, there was this idea that there are so many kids in foster care, they're lingering there for too long, we got to get them out of foster care. Well, you had me there, right? I agree with you there. But the policy solutions that we designed in ASFA really tell us what we think about the families that come into the system. So I just want to go through very quickly a couple of the policy choices that we made when we designed ASFA. We said there are so many kids in the foster care system, we got to get them out of there. But we never asked, why are those children coming into the foster system? We never said, are we taking too many kids into foster care? The presumption is perhaps we're not taking enough, right? So we have a very low threshold to separate families. We can separate kids from their parents anytime it's contrary to their welfare to be home with their mother and father. We also never paid any attention to the idea of supporting families around reunification. We said there's so many kids in the system and we need to get them out, but nobody asked the question of what are we doing to support these families who are stuck in the system to actually move out and reunify their families. No attention whatsoever to the idea of reasonable efforts because we had that toxic message out there that reasonable efforts kills, right? Reasonable efforts to support families staying together kills. We created, of course, strict timelines for family reunification. We said we will give families 15 months to reunify, and if not, we will extinguish those families forever. And then this is something you and I have talked about so much, April, that really to me gets to the dehumanization that kind of ASFA represents. We presumed that if families couldn't reunify within 15 months, they must be dismembered irrevocably and forever, right? So we have this presumption at the 15-month timeline. If you can't reunify, you should never see each other again. And of course, those of you in the room who've experienced ASFA know this is really complete family dismemberment, right? Kids are losing not only their moms and dads, they're losing their siblings, they're losing their grandmas, they're losing their aunts and uncles. So we could have said we're going to prioritize lifelong family connections for kids. Instead, we decided we're going to prioritize forever severing those relationships as quickly as we can. Of course, the financial incentives, which came up in the last panel, are dramatic. And then we also really created this system where we were morally neutral about whether we actually were going to give children something else when we took away their families, right? So there's no requirement in ASFA that if you are experiencing termination of parental rights, that there's an adoptive family waiting for you. So since ASFA was passed, we've seen the kind of legal orphan phenomenon, children aging out of care without any family to call their own. There are a lot of other policy harms there, but I'm going to stop there because I want to move on to kind of the next question, which I think is just as important. ASFA was racist by design, but it also produces racist outcomes. And I wonder if you could tell us, April, about what kind of racist outcomes does ASFA produce?
Absolutely. And I can relate to so much of what you're talking about in my personal experience of my mom being one of those crack mothers, right? My mom children, some of us being those crack babies that was considered inferior, that wasn't going to be smart, but still sitting here talking to you guys today. So it goes to show what kind of mentality it was. But the outcomes, I think about this often as a person with lived experience. I've had all three of my children removed from my care. I fought to get all my children back, but I was that parent that wasn't compliant, right? I just dropped off the face of the earth once my children got removed. So, and I'm not in an illusion that ASFA worked in my favor, because I know people ask me that, like, well, April, you got your kids back, so ASFA did what it was intended to do. Absolutely not. If it wasn't for my community and my village fighting to say, no, we're not going towards adoption, no, we're not doing this, because we know that due to that hierarchy, adoption is right after reunification. So I'm fortunate enough to have had my children back, but I still to this day see those harms within that separation. Still to this day, each child I have to hold on to and like coach through their trauma and my trauma in the same breath. So like I can't imagine, and I can say that 1,001 times, I cannot imagine what it would have been like if could never see my children again, if my children were never to be able to come home. And I understand that my story isn't the story of ASFA. Like this is not what happens to the majority of families. So I recognize that, and I fight on this issue because of that. Like I know that complete defeat when it comes down to losing your children, and no one should experience that internal death that comes along with separation. So we have to look at those outcomes. Like we know that Black children enter foster care at a higher rate and more likely to be institutionalized in congregate care. Like we know that 2.4 times more likely than white children to experience that termination of parental rights. Dorothy Roberts spoke once, and I was fortunate enough to hear her speak about it. But if this system is working how it's supposed to be working, we wouldn't have intergenerational people pulled into this child welfare system. Some of the same children that grew up in foster care or taken as teenagers have babies. Their babies is in the system as well. Like we know that it's not working. We know that this is not what it should be intended to do, but it's harming our communities at a way higher rate. Like, but I don't have that much time, so I'm not going to get into that. But we know the outcomes. The data is out there, and we're past the point of where we're going to keep collecting data that's already out there. It's time to like really look at this law for what it is and stop.
I could just add one more thing about ASFA that I think you raised, that intergenerational impact, and ASFA absolutely shows that in its design and its impact. And I want to flag just for a second that ASFA was the floor of how punitive we had to be. Many, many states have gone and decided to be way more punishing than ASFA requires them to be. So lots of states don't have 15-month timelines. They have shorter timelines. And a lot of states have created what we call aggravated circumstances, things that allow them to skip directly to the adoption process for all sorts of problems that our families that we work with every day face, like parental incarceration. I wonder if you want to talk for a minute about the interaction with incarceration, mass incarceration, and the child welfare system.
Oh, absolutely. It's so many correlations between these systems, right? Just the idea that if you had your rights terminated, say at 17 when you had your first child, and you have a child at 30, that's aggravated circumstances to take your new child, like with zero basis other than the fact that you had a child before and you was courting a system before. And that shows through that, once again, that data that 52% of our children, Black children, are going to experience the child welfare system, that's going to experience those investigations that's truly harmful. So you take that with the mass incarceration, you take our fathers, you drug and rape our mothers, you take our children, and now you're locking up our mothers and keeping our children generationally. Like, that's something is, once again, that I see within my community. And I'm not talking about everyone else's community. I'm talking about a person who was raised in deep poverty in one of the worst projects in Philadelphia, that I've seen these things. Like, half my family, like I'm one of 10 and 5 of 10 have been involved in this system. Like, I virtually know anyone that haven't been touched one way or the other by the family regular, family policing system. You guys know what I'm talking about. Like, those correlations matters, and we must recognize that absolutely they took and arrested and took so many of our brothers and fathers. I have so many family members that's in jail to this day on technicalities. And once again, that's a whole nother story we can get into.
And I'm recognizing we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to kind of start to think about with you, and I hope eventually when we get to do the community sessions, we can talk more about, like, we know that this is a system of laws that was designed with racist intent. And even if you can't agree with me that it was designed with racist intent, you don't see color and you just wanted safety, permanency, and well-being, it has a racist impact, and there's no denying that, right? So what is our obligation when we know that?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to take it first, Kathleen, and then I'm going to let you drill it home. Mm-hmm. But I will be remiss if I don't speak out at this moment about this. So many organizations put up Black Lives Matter slogans, we stand in solidarity, and all this good feel stuff, you know, is attached to people's emails, is in the front of everyone's business page, that Black Lives Matter, without ever looking internally of how are you perpetuating this racism? How are you destroying our families? How are you destroying our community? Like, take accountability with those organizations. So, like, in essence, I would love to see some of these organizations kind of put their money where their mouth is, right? Like, and actually stand behind. If you think Black Lives Matter, why don't Black children? Why don't Black mothers? Why don't Black fathers? Why are we being separated for reasons of poverty? Why are we being separated because I could not choose what family I was born in or the neighborhood I was born in? So above all, put your money where your mouth is. If you're thinking that, oh yes, we stand in solidarity, oh my God, this is horrible, what's happening? Like, let's start do something about it. Kathleen?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of this, you know, as somebody who shows up as a very privileged white professional in this work, I don't know if Joyce McMillan's still on the call, but she said something yesterday that I just loved, which is, you all spent too much money on your degrees, which I think we really need to think about what is the role of white professionals who are upholding ASFA, once we know, and we do know, that it racist both in impact and in design. And so, like, to me, I mean, family defense is like part of our daily resistance to the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And so we do that in our practice. But I also think it matters whether we're saying out loud that this is racist and harmful. And so when you're talking about those Black Lives Matter statements, I haven't actually seen a lot of statements on those same websites acknowledging that we are perpetuating racism and harm through our system of laws that ASFA has designed. And I actually want to let you take us home, April, if you have any other thoughts about what is our obligation in this moment.
I think a lot of it, you and I talk about that often, that relinquishment of power.
Yes.
Like you guys, as far as like government, white professionals, all of that, you've had the power, and you have had it for years, and you have handled it horribly. Right? You have destroyed families. You have removed morality. You not saying you, Kathleen. I actually like you. I'm just saying, as far as the system, like you have had this power. And it don't matter how much data we build. It don't matter how much we try to figure out why these things are occurring. Let it go. Can't relinquish that power. Give some to the community. Like I would say, just relinquish it because you did a shitty job. Excuse my language. It didn't work. You're horrible with good intentions, whatever. But let go of that power. Like give it back to us. Give it like. No data can tell you my lived experience. You can't put that in numbers. You can't put in numbers the tears that I've cried, the countless books and cards that I have wrote. You can't put that in number, those days that I couldn't hold another child because I couldn't see my children, those days that I would look for my children in the crowd of people just hoping to glance at them. You can't put that in numbers. And we need to get back to the humanity. We need to get back to understanding that we're people. Like we're people. And you'd be surprised at there's some tables that I sit at that is a foreign concept that Black people have emotions. Like, oh yes, I cry about my children. Yes, I love my children. I worry for my children more so now than ever. Like, yes, I have these emotions and these feelings, but when you're looking at it as numbers and you're looking at it as data and all these other things, you're missing the point that we're human. And no one deserves, if me as an individual did to my children with the child welfare system or the child policing system do to most children, I will be arrested. So.
Okay, I couldn't say any of that better, and I can't add to it. I'm just going to turn it over to Bishop Dinkins to bring in the whole Repeal ASFA Steering Committee.
Thank you, Kathleen and April, for such a powerful conversation. One of the things that Kathleen said that made so much sense to me, but I had to add on to it. She mentioned morally neutral policymaking. And I would venture out to say it's tone deaf, degenerative policy making that continues to dehumanize the lived experiences of Black families, to perpetuate what ASFA and the historical context of all of this policy making has done to perpetuate and increase poverty and incarceration rates, displacing blame from the states, and placing the actions of the state onto Black people, or creating these huge stigmatizing moments and narratives that vilify, Black and Indigenous people. And understanding that this is why, the ASFA steering committee, came together. And April, I love the fact how you mentioned that it's not about the data. I am not a number. And that's the problem. This quantitative data does not speak to the lived experiences of who we are. And so the absence of transpersonal data does not lead to transformational processes and policies that can take place. So I just want to thank you both, for pointing that out, and the fact that it is anti-racist rhetoric, because Black people or people who are not humanized are never seen as part of a solution, and they don't look for solutions. It's always, how do we continue to perpetuate the problem? And unfortunately, Black bodies, brown bodies have taken the brunt of the blows. And I'm just so glad that we're having this conversation, because we're now saying that, we're not made of Teflon, but we sure as hell is tired. And yeah, we are tired. We're tired of this. And so, again, I just want to thank you for such a rich conversation. And we're going to move forward in talking about like the ASFA steering committee and the campaign that we're developing. And this campaign is grounded in abolition and also centers, and it's being led by, people who have been harmed by, the ASFA law. Folks are gathered today. You've heard from people from academia, social work spaces, policy spaces, and other spaces, that are deemed important to us. But at the same time, they don't consider us. At the same time, everything is about reforming what they can do in order to, just add another layer of complexities and pain and grief and loss to families who are already experiencing, deep levels of trauma, to lose a child, to a system that thinks that they can parent better than we can, is absurd and ridiculous. And this is why I'm so glad that directly impacted mothers and indirectly impacted mothers and other organizers and people who really believe that this is a system that should be abolished have come together. And so what I'd like to do is just really move us into, where we are. Again, my name is Bishop Marcia Dinkins. I am the executive director and founder of Black Women Rising. And I am so honored to introduce this power-packed force of women who have done so many things in their communities, and they are raising their voice, around ASFA, reminding everybody enough is enough with this harmful, degenerative policy making that is not participatory, only punishable if you're Black. So my first guest that I'd like to introduce is Vonya Quarles. Vonya is the co-founder and director of Starting Over Incorporated. Welcome, Vonya. I am honored to introduce Ashley Albert, who is a powerful activist and parent advocate, and who has stood and put on some high heels to make an impact on abolition. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Kelis Houston, who is the founder of Village Arms. Welcome, my fellow sisters and fighters. How are you today?
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, all right. So let's get this party started. Vonya, I want to start with you. A lot of people are like, why ASFA? Why are you talking about it now? I'm quite sure a lot of people haven't heard about it. We always hear about child welfare, like welfare is really what they're doing. And we hear so much about this. But I'd like for you to explain to our listeners today, why us? I'd venture out to say, why not us? But how did the steering committee come together to engage in this work? That's to you, Vonya. You're still on mute.
Okay, I thought someone was going to unmute me. I thought it was going to happen magically. So for me, and that's a great question, Bishop. For me, ASFA wasn't on my radar. It was back in 2019. I don't know if you remember. I think probably all of us remember, but it was at the National Council for Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls at their convening, and they created space in that convening for folks to talk and share about the harms of the CPS system and federal policies like ASFA. And so that's when I first became aware of ASFA. I was fully and totally aware of the harms of the CPS, or the child regulation system in California. I had 3 children that had been adopted out. And so I was well aware of the pain and agony of these systems, but I had never knew that this target ASFA existed. And I think one of the beauty One of the most beautiful things about that particular conference is that they provide scholarships to so many system impacted people that it gave us the right energy. The panels that we did were well received, and out of that convening, we're here today. And so I'm just really grateful for the National Council and for meeting you all at that working conference and for being asked to be part of the National Steering Committee. So I think what's important, or what people might want to know, is by scholarshiping or making conferences accessible to people who've been impacted by the system is key to getting the work done. And who better to do this work than those of us who've been impacted by the system? So ASFA has this ticking time bomb, 15 of the last 22 months. And that has created more harm than any single policy that I can think of related to childcare. Because if a person is incarcerated and it's a woman, there's an 80% chance that she is a mother. So she might have babies at home, and her incarceration, at least in California, are usually the floor is 15 months. So most of us are incarcerated longer than that. So ASFA was really creating harm, even if we didn't know it by name. And so I think that was important. And I think that the women here and women across the country, the more we educate and educate them as to what ASFA does, how it impacts them, the stronger this movement to abolish ASFA is going to become.
Thank you, Vonya, for that. And yes, it was like a magical day, 2019. And one of the things that you mentioned that I think is so imperative in moving us into our next question, number one, scholarshiping and creating spaces, which we often don't see that. And so it just omits other people from being in the work. But you said a ticking time bomb. And so, Ashley, understanding that ASFA is a ticking time bomb, what does it mean for the campaign to be grounded in abolition?
Thank you, Bishop, for asking me that question. So we know that ASFA is a continuation of many troubling trends in the United States history, where oppressive forces were passing judgment on like who was worth it and who wasn't worth it. We hear about, abolishing the prison system, but we know it's the same narratives in the same framework that led out. We are not simply trying to disrupt ASFA as a policy, but also to disrupt all of the ideologies that allowed such a violent law to be created and harmed so many families for so long. We want to move away from reform and away from things that strengthen the family regulation system. We also acknowledge that the family regulation system and the criminal system are deeply, deeply intertwined. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ashley. We've heard that twice of how systems intertwine. We've also heard that this is a system that has already targeted, Black families, poor families, people who otherwise cannot stand up for themselves. And so, and because this is something that we don't know about, you find so many people who are muted and who are just caught by surprise, when they find themselves having their parental rights terminated. And Ashley, you use the word ideologies, which I think, that's a powerful word, because it's ideology such as this parents patriot, which means, the state can be a better parent than you, and because of these ideologies, it continues to perpetuate harm. But I also have to ask myself, and this is leading me to you, Kelis, is the fact that in this work, we have to have allies. We have to have people, support in our campaigns and to build these campaigns, but these ideologies sometimes get in the way. And so as a campaign, what are the best ways that allies can support the work without adding to the harm? How do we break down? How do we even identify these ideologies in order, to identify the right allies who can support the work without adding to the harm?
Thank you, Bishop. I would start by saying building networks and spaces for directly impacted people to connect, heal, grow, and work together, letting them lead on what those initiatives should be and what they should look like, opposed to creating these narratives and their own solutions, and then asking those directly impacted to contribute or participate. Making space and moving back. But also not simply focusing on the work that they can gain capital from. But also when there are opportunities to build capital, stepping back so that those that are under-resourced can benefit. I think they also should be aware of the power dynamics present in these relationships. And then just consider when they're asking people to share their story, if they're tokenizing them, using their story to get closer to a personal goal or professional goal that they hold themselves, or are they meaningfully supporting them and building relationship to better understand how the system has impacted them? And then lastly, I would say acknowledge when they're causing harm or have caused harm, because how they get there is equally as important as getting there. And then listening to those at the table. I've been at tables where there were so-called allies and they were resistant to what was being shared by those directly impacted in the quote unquote POC at the table. So listening and acknowledging those concerns as well.
No, that is so on point. You lifted up so many things, like the extractiveness in the work for some people, how they don't realize that they're re-traumatizing people because they only want to be extractive / transactional, and your story is their currency. They're getting grants off of our stories, or and extracting from our voices, but we're still flailing, and fighting and fighting blindly. Not only that, the power dynamics. I am a firm believer in that step up, step back, step away, step aside. If you're going to be that ally, assume the position with us, but know what position you need to assume. And you brought that home. I mean, if you are saying, that we want to talk about equitable or equity and equitable solutions, I don't need a white person talking about equity for a Black person. You can't talk about how equitable it is in the child sit in the family regulation system when you're the one who are, perpetuating the inequity. Mm-hmm. It's like, it was just said in the prior conversation, you messed it up, but they didn't mess it up for them. They messed it up for us. And so it's like these power dynamics really just continue to create this uneven distribution or acknowledgement. And if we're going to build that power, you are so right, Kelis, is that to be an ally means how to be in rhythm with us, and you help to create spaces and opportunity for our growth, for the liberation of our families, but for our voices to become unmuted, and for the frequency and the tonality of our pain to be raised at such a high decibel that it's blowing the sound and the eardrums of people who really need to hear you have done enough harm to the Black families and to the Black communities. And lastly, and Ashley, this is turning back over to you. You started out saying we have to connect, heal, and grow together, and so that means that inside of that, people have to be centered. And so, Ashley, why is it important to repeal ASFA in a way that centers directly impacted people and not social workers, academics? And let me say, some academics will say, I take offense to that because I am a scholar activist. I have two voices. So I'm using my scholarly activist voice. So I'm fighting with you in a different area. Let me tell you, I know, because they tell me that every day. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. And then policymakers, why is it important for people who are directly impacted to be centered in this work?
Oh, thank you, Bishop, for asking me this question. I am more than honored to answer this. My response to this is directly impacted people need to be centered, because when this law was created in 1997, at the time, those youth like myself were about 9 to 10 years old when they came into the system, and their parents, they are now the parents whose children are going into this family regulation system. They're being held accountable, for a law that was supposed to protect them, allegedly, right? That really came in and publicly disrespected Black mothers. It gave a platform for youth, for the Black mothers' children. Let me just talk about myself. It brought me into the system and told me that my mother was no good. She was a crackhead, okay? Because my mom did drugs, she was a crackhead, and she was not worthy to parent me. It told me that, that, and it was okay to be angry at her. It was okay to be angry at her. This was a federal law that publicly disrespected my mother and gave me permission to do the same thing. Never, not once did it tell me that all of those things my mother was dealing with had nothing to do with me or her parenting me as me being her child. So I grew up with a lot of perceptions and a lot of beliefs around being good enough and self-esteem. And really the biggest one is not being able to live without my parents. So I suffered from, people need to be centered at this work because they know what it's like, they're the ones who are going to tell this story. This law has to be repealed because the communities and the government has to be restored, and the imagination that comes with that, the healing has to take place. Repealing ASFA is, it ensures the accountability and builds relationships that, sustain. And it also tells those directly impacted that are leading the work that we're going to match what we say to what we do. And you're the experts. We don't know anything. We may have a lot, we may know a lot, but we don't know everything. And we can't tell you what that was like. We can't tell you what that law was like and how it affected and impacted. And so for myself, I stand with those directly impacted, because every time I go home and I continue to see, the disruption between my mother and my grandmother, my other siblings and my mother, the harm, the no room to restore that family bond. I stand in front on the front lines, and I ask those directly impacted too to come and stand on the front lines as a way to pay homage to my mother for this disrespectful law to Black women. Thank you, Bishop.
Did you not bring the fire? Did you not bring the fire? Thank you. I have one last question, and Vonya, I'm going to start with you. If each one of you would like to take a minute after Vonya to answer, just chime in on it, that'll be great. And after that, we'll be taking questions from the audience. But, Ashley, let me say one thing. You brought the fire, and what you made me think about was like this public-private relationship, and the fact that in the organizing work, we used to have a public-private training, and how privately these systems come together: hospital systems, school systems, child welfare systems, juvenile justice system, carceral systems, all of these systems that we're supposed to be able to trust, to protect, and to do certain things for us, are publicly destroying us. Because the statistics is out there. I just sent a note to, I think, Nat, around what was happening with children, especially around COVID. Everything about us is public, while they're privately destroying our families. They're privately destroying our generational lines. They're privately destroying, as you said, Ashley, they're destroying your hopes and your dreams and your self-esteem. They've basically just given us a one-sided coin, that has no value, because one-sided coin has no value. There's no currency, or this double-edged sword, and say they're equipping us, but the sword is dull. you know, because we don't have anything to fight with. So we can't even cut butter. But I really just wanted to honor the fact of how you spoke to this public disrespect and the platform that they create this to create this mistrust, and how the ideology has really landed and traumatized your family and really disrupted, as you said, the family bond, and how you saw your mother and how they wanted to say because she had a disease that she wasn't worth parenting. And that lets us know then there's no respect. Vonya, you know, Ashley started out with a lot of the narratives. I'd like to ask, how do we begin to unpack some of those harmful narratives that many people have internalized as we do the work of reimagining our communities without ASFA? We're not asking people just to daydream. We're asking you to reimagine. And I'll start with Vonya, and the rest of you can chime in, and then we'll go to questions and answers.
That's a great question, Bishop. I think the messaging and the movement has to be honest and direct. I mean, the government has had their way with this dominant narrative, creating the false illusion that the child welfare system, family regulation, family policing, family destruction, whatever you want to call it, that this system is actually there to do good by the families that it interacts with. And we know that to be false. We need to grab the narrative. We need to take the truth and make it available, both in our messaging, in our movement, and what we allow to take space in our psyche. Mm-hmm. There are people who really believe, who can comfortably believe that the child welfare system is a good system. They have to, because they're working there. And so the messaging has to reflect the data, not just the data that we're able to put on paper, but the more important data, like what Ashley can share. And some people would call it anecdotal, but that's the real data here. People, we're talking about our children, we're talking about our babies. I was in foster care. My children were in foster care, and I had to rescue my grandchildren from the foster care system. So to me, I've had lived experiences which allow me to take part in a movement that I know is going to save our children's lives, not just this generation, but those yet to come. But we cannot do this work in a vacuum. If there are people still sitting on the fence trying to make good out of a system that started to regulate indigenous families, Black families, that's what it was built to do. And that's the narrative that needs to be put forth. Not that this is some good system designed to help poor folks who just can't help themselves, because that's not what it does. The outcomes speak for themselves, and we have to take the narrative back and give it to the people.
Kelis, you want to add to that?
I think Vonya stated it beautifully, and it's what I do in my professional work. I do it personally, being open and transparent about this system. I'm at the table with child protection social workers, the decision makers here in Minnesota, and I'm always honest about the narrative. It is a broken, racist, and bureaucratic system, and we won't pretend while I'm in the conversation that it is not. Always bringing it back and causing them or encouraging them to acknowledge the harm the system causes to the families, and to really review their data in a way that tells the truth about what they're doing to those communities. So I think just always being open, honest, and transparent about it, even when it's uncomfortable to do so. The county workers are bullies. They do it not only with families, but they do it with community providers such as myself. So I train strong staff to do the same as I do, telling the truth about what they're doing to our families and opening their eyes to their own data. They use those narratives. I'm at tables where we're doing case consults, and when you hear what they're saying about Black fathers and the things that they say about Black mothers, there's no surprise that their workers are going out with this weapon. And one goal is to separate those children from those families. So I'm always checking it professionally, of course, but I'm always checking those narratives because they use that to fuel their fires. So just being strong, honest, and open.
Yeah, That's powerful. Ashley?
Yeah, I am, I am on the ground, in my community, in my family, you know, it's, telling them this is out there, this information is out there, pointing them to the direction so that they can go educate themselves and begin to understand that, these things that we take personal between our families, that actually there has been systems and policies put in place to not really support those harmful things and experiences that we had in our families. I see a lot of, right now I'm currently contracted with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence as a person with lived experience, interrupting and removing, redirecting from reform into abolition, because they have also seen, the disparities and the discrimination around DV victims and them coming into the child welfare system, and how, they are policed and their children are removed, right? And so, like, I am on the ground doing the work in my community, sharing my stories on platforms like this. Hopefully, with hope, while I'm putting myself out there, others find courage to do the same, so that we can collectively and collaboratively come together, because we, the ASFA steering committee, can't do this alone. We need all of you, and so, like, this is an opportunity for me to, just share in detail what that law has done to my family that I have seen in my home, and share that publicly with hope that someone else will step up and do the same.
That is so powerful. I want to thank you all, and the one thing I think that you bring home as a total is that, and even bringing in what Kathleen and April had talked about is this thing around the narrative. And what we do know is this, is that the narrative hasn't changed, just the title. And this is what makes policy making so degenerative, because we don't understand how they even define the problems, or how they define. And so you think about things like super predator and welfare queen, or single mothers for that matter, all of the narratives that are attached to that. And then from there, how there's this ideology or this way of thinking about how people are not equipped, capable to be able to handle, raising their children. And this narrative is strong. And if we don't snatch back the narrative, like you were saying, Vonya, then, they're telling our story. And then what we begin to see is the erasure of our voices in so many different levels. This just isn't an urban problem. We see this in rural areas too, because of the erasure or the monolithic view that people have, with like rural areas being rooted in this nostalgic whiteness. Don't get me started, because I'll go there. But at the end of the day, it takes all of us, not just some of us. And so what I'd like to do, it seems as though you all have spoken very clearly, precisely, and accurately. Nobody has any questions. So what I'd like to do is just to ask you all to do a reflection. Oh, we do have a question. Amanda Morgan Henry says, and I'd like for you all to reflect on this and just each take a turn answering it. White professionals in the field can only advocate against and call out racist policies to the extent that they individually acknowledge, Amanda, their own complicity in it. Now, she's asking y'all to also look at some white fragility up in here too. So thank you for that question, Amanda. And, Kelis, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Amanda. This is one of the primary barriers to my work in one of the largest and most diverse counties in Minnesota, where some of the most egregious disparities exist. I'm constantly bringing them back to the day-to-day practice that perpetuates the systemic harm and the disproportionality that everyone states that they want to address. but they don't address the individual practice that impacts it on a day-to-day basis. I found social workers resistant to change, although we push it on families in a very short time frame, as you all know, that 6-month timeline. But I found that the social workers in the field are blind to it. And as Vonya stated, I think they have to have some sense of cognitive dissonance in order to remain in this system. I found some really great social workers that actually leave. One of them stating that the child welfare policies went against their own personal ethics. And so she left as a social worker. But I think that was a great point, and one of the reasons that we continue to see what we see in child welfare. And not only that, a lot of the white professionals or the professionals in the field in general have immunity, and there's no accountability for bad practice and inequitable decision making. Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah. Vonya?
Yes. Thank you, Amanda. I don't see it as a question. I read it as a statement. And so I didn't want to really go into speaking on that. I think white folks can figure that out. And I don't want to be part of turning this conversation into that. I would just like to reflect on the work that can be done locally, and community recognizing the power that we have. So on the local level, we're working with families, system impacted families, and building community with them so that they can become advocates. As social workers write reports, we're training them on how they can write reports for the court, how they can keep journals, and how they can tell their own stories to a courtroom. We recognize that there is no due process in the child welfare system, and we need to work on that. And I think ASFA, abolishing ASFA, is a step in the right direction. But as Ashley and Kelis pointed out, it's not the only step. We have lots of work to do, and I'm glad to be doing it with you all.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Ayala Fetter Hogabook. And if I messed up your name, charge it to my head and not my heart. But Ayala asks, is there any way to work in child welfare and not perpetuate harm and violence? She states she is an MSW student planning to work for the child welfare system in her state and feel that no matter how good she plans to be, she'll be supporting an oppressive system. So her question is there any way to work in child welfare and not perpetuate harm and violence? Vonya,
No. So I think that's a wonderful question, Ayala, and the fact that you're asking that question to me speaks about your ethics and your character, wanting to know if if you can go in there and actually do good. And I think the answer to that is how open that system would be to change from the inside. And if you have that kind of energy it would take to do that, or if you would find yourself more fulfilled in doing social work in a different capacity. I think there are opportunities to support women and families outside of the CPS or child welfare system. And if you're really wanting to do good, you might want to consider other options. But I don't know what state you're in. That's just me coming from outside. So take it with a grain of salt.
Sometimes coming from outside helps a lot on the inside, Vonya. Don't discredit that. Ashley, would you like to, piggyback off of that, please?
So yes, I don't know how that is possible. Just to be honest,
I do.
I personally had social workers leave my case. They told me that they could not work in that system, removing children from mothers who were trying their hardest. So I don't know how that would be. I guess my response would be, don't even go work for them. But with all due respect, I have had social workers on my case that really didn't like read the stuff on paper. Like they really got a chance to see me like to have someone come into your home, a social worker that doesn't look like you, kick her shoes off, crawl up on your sofa, crisscross applesauce, engage in conversation, and really begin to ask me, what do I need, as opposed to telling me what do I need, and then really explaining to me, meeting me where I was at. She didn't stay for on the case, but I think having someone looking at the individual and asking questions and meeting them where they're at, instead of like in this general broad, like incubated way.
Thank you.
Bishop, I'd like to add something here because I have a different view. We have to shake things up from the outside, but as well as the inside. So we need social workers who are courageous, because that's what it's going to take, but also passionate about family preservation and reunification, and that can bring that lens into the field. Social workers hold a lot of power. And just to give you a quick example of that, because I know we're short on time, we just recently had a case where a mother was at the end of her timeline. Permanency was on the table. They had already written up the termination of parental rights petition. They changed her social worker in the 11th hour. This African-American social worker came in for this mother and her 5 children and completely changed the course of action. Her children were reunified in a matter of a month, and the case closed. So you going in, just knowing what you're up against, because it's going to take courage. I do a lot of praying before every meeting, anything I'm doing with this, because it's a huge system that's been in place for some time. So it's hard work, but going in with that lens to do something different, do your research before you start so you understand exactly what this system is doing, because there's a lot of false narratives that exist within child protection that causes that culture or allows for that culture to continue. So going in honest, going in strong and aware of what you're up against, but you'll have the opportunity to do some good work. And I would encourage you to do that and lean on some of the parents that are out here advocating. Make some friends with folks that are working to change this system to help them kind of inform your work as you move forward. But we could absolutely use you in that field.
Absolutely. And I would say 2 things. One, remember to keep it humanized. You know, when you move away from a humanistic approach and you just go by the letter, you forget that life happens, and people need that grace and understanding that life happens. And secondly, there are some social work programs where you can take a few classes around social justice, get an understanding of the stories of directly impacted people, and have conversations with them. Once you lose the lens of the human experience or the human condition, then you become robotic to the systems or the systemic approaches. We have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap things up. So this question comes from Rebecca Amati. She asks, is there any role for academic activists? I can answer that. I do feel like academia is inherently white supremacist, but I do find that there are a lot of Black scholars who are deeply rooted with their communities doing work, especially when they are personally impacted. What is the balance? I can answer that if you like.
Shoot, Bishop.
So Rebecca, that's a great question. And the truth of the matter is a lot of scholar activists or academic activists, they're struggling with trying to find what that balance is. And really the balance is just finding your voice in the work. There are ways that academia can participate. One would be putting the pen to the paper, but being truthful and transparent about it, increasing, qualitative research, bringing in the lived experiences of those who are directly impacted so that we can have some transformational processes in our work. It is about learning and being a part of the community, but also seeing what inside of your academic voice that can be, how can you turn up the volume? Because the thing about it is this: most people in academia, they're writing papers. One reference that I would give is there was a lady who wrote, a Black woman from the Union of Concerned Scientists. She wrote an open letter, and she really spoke about how she could be involved. Sometimes that's the only way that a person can step up. So we have to remember that there's not just one way to use our voice. I think, as Kelis has pointed out, Ashley has pointed out, Vonya, April, and Christian have all pointed out, we all have a voice. We all have a say in this, you know, and when we get the choir in tune, we can have a universal hum that can rock this nation and begin the abolitionist process of breaking down these unfair systems that continue to perpetuate harm. And if your hum is on the computer, then just find a way to integrate that hum in the community. And with women like Vonya and Kelis and Ashley and myself, who's also an, you know, I'm not only a scholar, but I've organized and I've done, you know, direct service and direct action, you know, and so just remembering your academic voice can either keep things participatory and humanize the work, or it can make it non-participatory and dehumanize the work. You just have to figure out how you want to use your voice and what side of the stage you're going to stand on. Because we could use, as my grandbaby would say, we could use every stuff. We can use every stuff in this fight, because as she also says, we don't even just have to ask questions. We have to tell some questions in this space. So April and Kathleen, and Kathleen, forgive me because I called you Christian. Again, I'm seasoned, honey. Forgive me. I suffer sometimes from can't remember stuff. But if you'd like to, I think, add in, you know, Kathleen, you said that, you know, the one thing Joyce McMillan said is you spend too much on education. But I also believe that investment in education can pay off. So, you know, again, if you and April have anything you'd like to add to this discussion, starting with you, Kathleen, on this question that was just asked, what say ye, and how do we bring this all together so that we can begin to take this ticking time bomb and abolish it?
Well, I don't want to be the one to close us out, because I'm learning so much just in this moment right now from you all. And I just, you know, we talked a little bit earlier about the role of white professionals in all of this. And like, to me, the role is like humility and constant learning. And that's what I'm here to do with you all. So I'm not going to take this moment to finish this out, but I do want to see if April has anything she wants to add.
Not to this question particularly, but I did want to tell the social worker, come to our side. Like, come
be a family defender. Yes.
Come to family defense, parent defense, right? We need some great people to continue this fight right now, because not to say that all attorneys are bad, but I believe that no parent should just have an attorney. They should have a social worker or parent advocate like myself that's truly connected to that parent and that parent only, like under that confidentiality realm, to where they don't have to report. So come to the light. That's it.
No, you didn't call Carol Ann to the light, April. Come, Carol Ann, follow the light. Follow the light. April, Kathleen, Kelis, Ashley, Vonya, upEND, thank you for the opportunity to have this rich discussion. I learned so much, and I really hope we have given, you know, individuals something, you know, some food for thought, something to think about, and really our scholars something to write about. And remembering, again, in order for a fight to be a good fight, it has to be a full fight composed of all the voices that's needed and necessary for the solutions and the changes that we need. One family, one community, one hope, and one dream at a time. And I just want to thank you all again. And I'm going to turn it back over to Christian Weber. Thank you.
Thank you all. I didn't know about folks in the audience, but my heart is racing. My head is racing. This was just such an amazing panel. I have just deep respect for you all, and thank you all for honoring us with your wisdom and being willing to share with all of us. So with that, I am going to take us into sort of a break, sort of a session, go meet more people in a session. So for the next 30 minutes, similar to yesterday, we held space for imagination, connection, and restoration. And so you have some options, folks, in the audience. You can join Benjamin and go into the creative space again. I think this conversation and the one earlier might have generated some of your creative juices. So feel free to go in and see, work with Benjamin. You can also connect one-on-one. I saw again in the chat, which was super robust, that people were having conversations among each other. And so go ahead and go to the networking space and meet somebody one-on-one. But also we're going to open up session spaces. So if you really just didn't get a chance to ask your question of this latest panel, or want to just engage with them more and hear and learn with them more, not all of them, but a lot of them are going to head into a session space. So go check it out and go find them in the session space. And then also we're going to open up some session spaces on particular topics and encourage you to go in there and talk amongst each other. It will not be moderated by anybody. It's a free space. So go in there and connect with one another. There will be people there who will help with the technology, but really it is your space to be in community and have these conversations, some of which were happening over the chat. Or if you need to, just take a break because that was a lot. And then we'll come back at 4 o'clock Eastern to close everybody out. Thanks so much.